Hey everyone, this is James here from the DevGenie Academy, and in this particular episode we're going to be looking at the render management class. We need to make some changes to this and split this off, because for future episodes, for example next week, when we look at terrains, it's going to be handled slightly different to our entity, and also when we look at water, that will also be slightly different too. So first things first, in the core package, create a new package called rendering, move the render manager class into that rendering screen, and we can create a new interface called iRenderer. There we go. So in the interface, it needs to extend a uppercase T, which means it's an object. And in here, we can just add in the standard functions that we already have. So that's a public void init, which throws an exception, a public void renderer, which passes in a camera, a point light of list, a spotlight of list, and a directional light. We can also add in the new functions that we created last week. The bind function, first of all, will be abstract, so that's an abstract void bind. We'll keep in the model parameter for now, but we may need to change that later on. We can then add in the public void unbind method, and we can do the public void prepare method. So instead of adding in the entity here, we add the T of the object and the camera. And the final method that we need is the public void cleanup method, and that will complete our iRenderer interface for now. We may need to come back here and change it, but next up in the render manager, we need to basically strip everything away from it that relates to the shader. So this private shader manager, if we comment it out, we can see how many lines of code are actually being affected by this. So what we'll do is we'll uncomment back out for now, and we will create a new class inside of the rendering package. We're going to call this entity renderer, and this will basically have everything we've got in render manager currently, but we'll add it in here so we can then customize the render manager to be more of a master renderer class. So the entity renderer needs to implement iRenderer, and we need to create a shader manager, and we need to create that private map of model and the list of entities, because this is the unique class that will access those entities. And we need to import entity. That will be our own class. There we go. So next up, we can create a constructor for this class. So it's just a public entity renderer, and we can throw an exception just in case there's any issues. We can instance the entities to a new hash map. There we go. And we can also say shader equals a new shader manager. There we go. And we just need to import list to that. That's where we got that error on the hash map. There we go. And finally import the map as well. There we go. So for the init method, if we move back to our render manager, basically everything relating to the shader in this method can be removed. So that's all of this. And we've already created an instance of the shader manager, so we can keep that one there for now. There we go. So that's all of the shader code for the init method. Next up, let's move into the render manager render method, and from where shader.bind is called, we can go up to render lights. We can also do the for loop as well, and we can go to the entities.clear and the shader.unbind. So we grab all of that code out of there, drop it into our own render method, and we need a way of accessing window. And we can do that by calling launcher.getWindow, and we can call our render manager.renderLights. For that, we need to make that a static class. So if we go to our render lights function, we can do public static void render lights, and that should resolve that. This will cause errors in the render lights method, but for now we'll leave that and we'll come back to that later. Next up is the bind method. So if we grab pretty much everything in the current bind method of render manager, pass that across into our entity renderer, and the same for the unbind method too. Grab all of that out and drop it into there. That's it. So for the prepare method, we need to grab those 3 lines as well. So this is pretty much just copy and pasting those all in there. And for the cleanup method, it's just a simple call to shader.cleanup. So before we go and correct some of the errors, just create a getter for the entities, and that will return the map of the model and list of entities. The prepare method, we need to change that from object T to object entity, and in the create transformation matrix, we need to cast entity to a entity of a class. This will resolve the errors that we have in Entity Renderer, but we still have some in Render Manager. So if we move across to that class, and first things first, if we remove the instance of Shader Manager from here and change that to a private Entity Renderer of Entity Renderer, and in the init method, we can now say entity renderer equals a new entity renderer. We also need to get rid of that map of the entities, and we can call after the initialization of entity renderer, we can just call entity renderer.init. But in the render lights, we need to change this, so instead of passing in the camera, we can get rid of that and we can pass in the actual shader itself. So at the end of the function, we can do shader manager shader. That will fix the issues in the render lights function. So if we move across to the render method, we need a way of calling entity renderer.render. We pass in the camera, the point lights, the spotlights, and the directional lights, and that will start rendering the entity itself, or entities. Next up is this process entities itself. So instead of doing the local instance of entities, we can do entity renderer.get entities, .get entity, .get model, and in the else method we can do the same thing here by using entity renderer.get entities. One thing I also want to do is the variable name of entity renderer. I want to rename that, so we can refactor it, call it entity renderer, that's it, and back into the code itself. There's only one error left, which is in the cleanup method. So all we need to do here is, instead of calling shader.cleanup, we can call entity renderer.cleanup. And that is pretty much everything we need to do in the render manager class. But in fixing that, we have now created errors in the entity renderer. First, get rid of the bind, unbind, and process functions. And in the render light, we can pass the shader in there and remove the camera, and that'll fix the issue there. The last thing I want to do in the entity renderer class is in the init method, creating vertex and fragment shaders. I want to change the name of the shader files to entity_vertex and entity_fragment. And then if you go into your directory of your project and just rename those files, there's no change to the code needed here. So we can now go ahead and run the code, and we can see that our scene of the 200 blocks is being rendered as usual. Our spotlight is still being rendered to the screen as well. So next week we'll look at the terrain renderer. So thanks very much for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you next week.